Hello, my name is Lucretia Anderson. I'm the Manager of Historical Education for Maymont Foundation, and I welcome you to Maymont House, the home of James Henry Dooley and Sally Mae Dooley from 1893 to 1925. James Dooley was amongst the first in the millionaire class here in the U.S. following the Reconstruction era. He built his wealth with his railroad, real estate, and iron and steel holdings, and was part of a group of capitalists who at the time played a hand in the rebuilding of the South's post-Civil War economy. A Confederate veteran and the son of Irish immigrants, James was also a philanthropist and major art collector. Sally Mae Dooley came from a long line of prominent Virginian families. She enjoyed studying literature, horticulture, was a socialite, and sat on the executive committee of several Southern women's heritage organizations. Together, the couple built one of their dream homes on what was then the rolling countryside. The late Victorian era Gilded Age home was built on 100 acres of what used to be a dairy farm outside of the city of Richmond. The Dooleys left the home and the estate to the city of Richmond to be enjoyed by all as a house museum and a place of leisure. Anywhere from 7 to 10 domestic staff and a number of groundskeepers and yardmen were employed while the Dooleys were here in residence, most of whom were African American. Between 1919 to 1925, the lives of the Dooleys and the maintenance of their home and significant art collection was upheld by the men and women whose life of labor made way for a life of leisure. We invite you to watch as our actor-interpreters share the stories of resilience, wisdom, and skill of some of those staff members who lived and worked here during the Jim Crow era. You'll also get a peek at several spaces around the home to learn about the work that took place there.
We are returning from war. The crisis and tens of thousands of black men were drafted into a great struggle for bleeding France and what she means and has meant and will mean to us and humanity. And against the threat of German race arrogance, we fought gladly until the last drop of blood. For America and her highest ideas, we fought in far-off hope. For the Southern dominant oligarchy entrenched in Washington, we fought in bitter resignation. But today, we return. These words, now they mean something about service. Giving yourself over to a worthy cause, nothing greater than that, even though sometimes you're not always seen as a hero. And those are not my words, though. No, that's W.E.B. Du Bois. He's talking about what it was like for a Negro man to come home after fighting during the First World War, fighting as equals over there in France, only to be treated as lesser than coming home. That man had a fire under him to lift us up out of being subservient to white folks and into educating ourselves. He sure did. My name is John Thomas Walker, though most folks call me Tom. I'm one of the Walker family that worked at Maymont for a time. But before that, I went off to fight during World War I with thousands of other black men in the U.S. Army's Expeditionary Force. Well, going off to France, seeing a little bit of the world, well, that was an education in itself. And I did learn a lot. They had me driving a truck, moving supplies and men around. And the things I saw over there might be more of an education than I ever needed. I've been in service my whole life. And I didn't have the opportunity for formal school, but I surely learned what it was to serve with dedication from my mother, Mrs. Frances Twiggs Walker. She was the matriarch of our family and head cook for the Dooleys at Maymont House. I worked in the house for a time as one of the butlers while she and my sisters did the cooking, cleaning, and caring for the folks living there. Everything she taught me, I go on to use in my own house. And when I moved me and some of my other family members up to Philadelphia, I'm told we were part of what they call the Great Migration, a time when a lot of us black folks were heading up north. And we went up there looking for better opportunities for work and to escape some of the aggression towards Negro folks down south. We thought things might be different in Philadelphia, home of the Liberty Bell. Thought there might be more freedom, less of a chance for being targeted for violence. Unfortunately, that wasn't always necessarily the case, just like W.E. Du Bois talked about in his poem. And we didn't have much freedom in the kinds of work we could do either. We still found ourselves working in domestic service or cooking or serving others to some degree, although we also found work in some of the factories too. It seemed that everything we did involved hard labor. When I first got to Philadelphia, I used those skills my mama taught me to work as a cook in a country club. Eventually, I wanted to move away from service work altogether. Instead, I did some work in a factory and then construction. Whatever I did, I tried to take pride in it, though. That's what my family taught me. I have to say, I'm probably proudest of my time as a volunteer fireman. There were not many of us black firemen at the time, for sure. And well, giving back to my community was always important to me. My greatest act of service, though, was taking care of my family. With 5 children, it was a lot of caring to do. Also made sure that any of the walkers that wanted to move on up from Richmond to Philadelphia were able to do so by offering them a place to stay for a while. Although all they had to put up with was my opera records. Oh, I love the opera. Sure did. Have you ever heard of Marian Anderson? Now, she was something else. What you call a contralto. She made us proud to hear a black woman singing down there at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., when the DAR wouldn't let her sing at Constitution Hall. But I liked her best singing on the record in my living room. Yes. You know, those voices in opera can take you to a whole other place. Heavenly almost. When you work as hard as I have my whole life, it's important to find things that give you some joy and peace in life. No matter where you come from or what kind of work you do. Serving folks or otherwise.
I'm sure you can guess which room of the home we're standing in now. This is the formal dining room. The Dooleys would more than likely be served their daily dinners and suppers here, as well as hosted dinner parties and receptions in this space. Meals would be served à la Russe, which is the Russian style of being served one course at a time by the head butler and under butler. Between 1919 to 1925, the second butler would have served under Mr. William Dilworth, the head butler and supervisor of the domestic staff in the main living areas of the home. Through this swinging door is the butler's pantry. The butler's pantry served as the main headquarters for Mr. Dilworth, as he coordinated the service of the household above stairs. The domestic staff were expected to operate like a well-oiled and invisible machine, taking care of the daily needs of the Dooleys and their guests from behind the scenes. From the butler's pantry to the first floor living hall, you can see evidence of how the staff were to remain inconspicuous while in service. Service doors to the library, drawing rooms, and dining rooms, as well as the network of service stairs connecting the basement area to the top floor of the house, reinforced the contrast between the servant and the served. Housekeeper, cook, domestic. Those are my titles. We never did like the word servant. Just didn't sound right to us. Especially those of us who came up after slavery had ended and we were supposed to be able to live free. Not much we could do about it, though. That's mostly what we were called by the folks we worked for. It seemed like they needed to call us that, showed their status and authority over us. But my name is Emma S. Harrison. And I guess if I had the choice, I would call myself a domestic tradeswoman. I heard that once, and yes, I like the sound of that. You won't really see me in pictures or hear many stories told about me. If you were a guest of the Dooleys, you probably wouldn't even notice me at all. It was my job to be unnoticed, unseen, unless you want something. And as a live-in housekeeper, there seemed like there was always something wanted. I could be called to the carpet at any point in the day. I took my breaks when directed, got my sleep when I could, but always with one ear ready to hear that bell from the call box anytime, day or night. Then I'd get myself together and go to the library or the morning room or one of the missus' bedrooms and see what was needed. I worked at Maymont for the Dooleys for about 5 years. And though I happened to live there, that wasn't the case for everybody. Well, some of us lived in, especially the cook or the underbutler, meaning we stayed in one of the rooms in the basement or the housekeeper room up on the 3rd floor. But most of us lived out in homes with our families. But the work hours were so long, it was hard to catch up with family or go to church where we could get caught up with the rest of our folks. But we did what we could on our Thursday afternoons or every other Sunday off. Most everybody went to church on their Sundays off, either in Jackson Ward, which was my neighborhood, or near Maymont in Randolph. There we could get our spirits lifted and get together with community. It was our social time. But it was also where we could learn all the other things going on, like Miss Maggie Walker's trolley strike, or who was saving up money in which banks and such. You know, ways to build each other up. Because Lord knows, with Jim Crow, it seemed like everybody else was trying to tear us down. Oh, and the parties we would have sometimes after work. Now that was a good time. Ooh, blow off some steam, you know. Ooh, we dancing and laughing. You know. Sometimes we'd go on over to whoever was living over the garage on their employer's property. Just enjoy ourselves. No, we was tired, but we went anyway. You know, so we could be together. It was important. Can't be doing this type of work feeling like you're alone all the time. It just won't last. You see, even if our employers treated us good, they weren't the same as friends and family. Do you understand? Oh, we all had our roles at the house and on the property. I took care of just about all the cleaning and laundering, made sure the fires was going in the fireplace and swept out the embers, kept the coal dust that kept coming in those big windows from that railroad down the hill. I made sure the flowers were freshened up and helped out with other things that needed to be done around the house on occasion. There was no end to the dusting and polishing, as all of Mr. and Mrs. Dooley's paintings and furniture and such came over from Europe. There was always so much to do. Yeah, we all had our roles. And, well, that was mine at Maymont. Well, I got along fine with the Dooleys. After a while, though, I went on to another household. Yeah, I got myself a good recommendation from Mrs. Dooley and took an opportunity to make a little more money as a cook for the Sawyer family. You know the Sawyers? They got that big sign over there on their building over on Broad Street. Yes, Mr. C.F. Sawyer was a pharmacist and a businessman, and you probably know him as the extract man. Yes. Had that extracts factory over there. Ooh, you could smell it up and down Broad Street. Mr. Sawyer also purchased that Duke's mayonnaise company. Yeah, people love that stuff on the sandwiches and such. You know, we never did want for flavors and things for my kitchen in that house. Look, he sold his products that made folks lip smack while I made his family smack their own lips with my cooking. And when it was time to leave there, I went over to work for the A. Reed Venable family. Now that's a real big old family from down there in Farmville. Yeah, most of us domestic tradeswomen, we moved around a little bit, always talking to each other, finding out what houses had good people in them, good people to work for, maybe just a little more money, or just something different. If we couldn't choose the kind of work we did, We at least had a say-so in who we did all this hard work for. Located on the basement level of the house was a maid's room and a butler's room, amongst other spaces for the staff. As most of the domestic staff lived out or off the estate, this room might have been temporarily occupied by one of the maids who were in residence here. More often than not, it was a place to work and rest during break times. The furnace would have been used to heat up irons for ironing clothes and other linen used around the house. The sewing machine to mend everything from wardrobe to curtains. The housemaids were expected to have several skill sets in order to help maintain the opulence upstairs. These beds would have been occupied by female staff members getting some rest between tasks, or spending the night after working late hours for an event held by the Dooleys. The working and resting spaces for the staff were practical spaces, unlike the rooms of leisure in the rest of the house.
Well, you can tell by my hands where I spend my time. I've always loved spending my time outside, feeling the dirt between my fingers, being alone with my thoughts, for the most part. I'm James Patrick Lewis. My family calls me Jimmy. And when I worked at Maymont, it was as a yardman under Mr. Tolliver. Every now and then I went inside to work as one of the butlers and driving those fine cars for the Dooleys. Well, serving on the inside was fine, all right. I'd have to get suited up and help with serving the meals at one of the functions Mr. and Mrs. Dooley would have. I never did mind putting on a suit, even if it was butler's tails. Mr. Dilworth, the head butler, would make sure that we paid careful mind to all of the gentlemen and ladies. Know what they need before they do. Make the Dooleys look good by seeing how fine their servants were. But when I wasn't having to pay attention to the guests, I was keeping an eye on all of the fresh flowers that they had us and the maids decorate the house with. Mrs. Dooley loved showing off her flowers from the gardens. And of course, I took pride in knowing they were there because of some of my own handiwork. Yeah, and Mrs. Dooley, she was a nature lover too. You could see that all throughout the house, on the walls and ceilings. Especially those ceilings. Had a whole sky painted right there in her pink and gold room. Yeah, as I said, it was all right sometimes. But I always preferred being in the gardens, hauling dirt and hay, planting things. It's nothing better than watching something grow and knowing you took the time to care for it and help it along. I did the same type of work when I went on to work for Dr. Bryan and Mrs. Bryan on Monument Avenue. They had me there as a butler and chauffeur, but when they seen how much I loved plants and flowers, they had me make a garden for them. I love doing that. Like I said, anything to get me outside and enjoying nature. I made sure I taught my nieces and nephews that too. You may have to be of service to others in their big homes or grinding yourself down in a factory somewhere, but whenever you get outside, you make sure that you pay attention to nature. Love on her, and let her love on you a little bit.
This room, enrobed in gold roses and with depictions of the sky on the ceiling, evokes the sensation of being in the meticulously maintained gardens just outside the Dooley's door. The beauty of Maymont's gardens would have been directly correlated to the tireless hard work and hours put in by the groundskeepers such as James Patrick Lewis. Digging, planting, weeding, watering, pruning, and caring for each plant, flower, tree, and herb on this 100-acre estate would have taken the care, knowledge, and expertise of around 20 groundskeepers. The work of the groundskeepers didn't end after the plants had bloomed. They would spend extensive amounts of time cutting these blooms daily to be arranged throughout Maymont House. The gardens you may walk through today are the legacy of these experienced horticulturists and their tireless efforts to create the beauty you see around you. I don't know what much there is to say about my work in domestic service. Times were really changing at that point. Not everyone worked in somebody's house, but most of us did. My mother and father, they couldn't afford to send us to the new schools that were popping up for black folks here and there. There were some of those technical schools like Hartshorn and Virginia Union here in Richmond, but that wasn't something that we were able to do at the time. It was nice to see folks like me getting educated and coming up in the world. It did give us something to hope for. We knew education was important for all of us to be able to live a little bit better. I know that my mother wanted that for her grandchildren, but for her children, well, it just wasn't possible for the time. I guess when my mother got to Maymont, she jumped on the chance to get some of us jobs with her. Best to keep us all together, train us up for service herself, and make sure we had a decent place to work. That's how me and 5 of my brothers and sisters came to work at Maymont. Let's see, it was me, Hannah, Abraham, Tom, Joseph, and Mary. We all worked at Maymont at some point or other, right before the Dooleys passed. I was never one to complain, but that work was in no way easy. There was some good times too, though, you know. Mostly because we were together. My name is Frances Walker. But don't mix me up with my mama. That was Frances Twiggs Walker, the head cook. We called her Mother Mary. I came in to start working with her as an assistant kitchen maid when I was about 15 years old. I learned everything I know about being dedicated to my cooking and the families we served from my mama. We worked day and night. That was most all I knew. Get up in the morning by 6 a.m., get our uniforms on in Mother's rooms above the Dooley's garage across the lane from the house, make our way down into the basement of the house, and there we stayed, making sure everyone in the house got fed all throughout the day, every day. We spent most of our waking hours in that kitchen. And once everything was cleaned up and ready for the next day, we'd go on back across the lane, lay our heads down, and get a little sleep before doing it all again. Summers were only slightly different. Most of the house workers went up to Afton Mountain to serve Mr. and Mrs. Dooley up there at their summer house. They called it Swananoa Palace. Some folks stayed here, closed up, and then opened up the house again. But the Dooleys weren't going to go without my mother's cooking, so away we went. But it was real hard, not being close to the whole family during those times, and the work sure wasn't easier, but when I did get to breathe in that fresh mountain air, it was a treat. Now, after Mrs. Dooley passed in 1925, we were all split apart again until some of my family moved on up to Philadelphia. We can thank Tom for that, letting us stay with him for a while until we got jobs and places of our own. Family really was so important for us. But it was hard, so hard to keep us together. I look around at all the families we worked for. They really got to enjoy time with each other. It wasn't until we started working together at Maymont that I really saw my mother much. She was always working and living in at the wealthy folks' houses on Franklin Street and Gray Street, while us children stayed with all kinds of other family members. I guess, following in her footsteps, I did the same thing. My children, Doris, John, and Joseph, ended up staying with relatives most of their childhood. I just couldn't have them with me like my mama did for a time. Mama must have thanked God when the Dooleys tasted her cooking at one of their friends' dinners and invited her to come work at Maymont. At least that's what I think happened. The wealthy white folks were always looking to have the best staff, especially cooks. And my mama was one of the best. And she taught us to be the same. Now, that's how come I was able to find work with the Rabinowitzes for so long up in Philadelphia. I suppose so. It was nice to see some of that change by the time I moved back down to Richmond. Black folks weren't living in with their employers so much anymore. Could see their children and their family more. That's been real nice. Well, as I said, don't know how much more there is to say about that. The garage would have been a space initially used as a stable, but by the 1920s, it had been converted to the garage you see on the estate today. However, it was not simply the storage area you may associate with a modern garage. During the Dooley's lifetime, it would have also been a workspace and a home as well. Its lower levels would have been devoted to the vehicles driven by the Dooley chauffeurs. The main level would have been the estate manager's office, and where he and the talented groundskeepers would have planned out the estate's gardens. And last but not least was the uppermost level, where there was a finished living space. This living space was a loft with open rafters, where the head chef, Mrs. Frances Twiggs Walker, and at least one of her daughters would have slept at the end of their exceedingly long days.
Hold on to it, tell them eagles grin.
I'm Fanny Waddy. And well, let's see. Georgia. Georgia Anderson and I both worked real close to Mrs. Dooley. I suppose our service was all about taking care of her, getting her dressed and bathed, taking care of her clothes and all that. And we did that right on up until she passed. You know, when you're a lady's maid or a personal maid, you get to know your employer real well. It's funny to me because I think they don't think we're paying much attention just because they may not pay us much mind, except for making sure we know how best to serve what they need. But oh yes, we knew a whole lot about the people we worked for. For example, well, let me take you back. A little bit before I worked at Maymont, I did work as a live-in maid for a few other families. I guess they're pretty well known. First, I was over there on Park Avenue at Bishop Gibson's house. You may not know who Bishop Gibson was. That was Bishop Robert Atkinson Gibson. And for a long time, he was the Episcopal bishop in Virginia. That man did a whole lot before he passed. He made sure there were black Episcopalian parishes all over Virginia. And I don't know if you ever heard of that Shrinemont retreat up there in the mountains in Orkney Springs. But at first, that was their summer house before they turned it into a church retreat. And yep, we'd have to go all the way up there every summer, just so the bishop and family could escape the heat and everything. After I was there a couple years, I went to work for the Mayo family. Now, Peter H. Mayo was another businessman. His family was in the tobacco business, and if I remember correctly, he brought rolled cigarette making here to Richmond. And well, we know that's a big business right there. Yes, so while he was doing all that, I was right there making sure they had all their daily needs in his house. But here I go talking about all the other houses I worked in when I'm supposed to talk about my time here at Maymont. Now, I didn't live in at Maymont, though I did sleep down in the basement some nights. I was renting out a room at the Fifes at that point, and well, those weren't the easiest times to be Mrs. Dooley's personal maid. I saw her through the passing of Mr. Dooley in 1922. Things got much harder for her after that. And me and Georgia and Miss Elder, you know, Mrs. Dooley's niece. Well, we got Mrs. Dooley through her own illness in the next few years after Mr. Dooley passed. Yes, I did get to know the Dooleys real well, but you know, Miss Elder and the other nieces had me burn all Mr. and Mrs. papers after Mrs. Dooley died. So I don't know how much I'm supposed to go into telling you about her. One thing you should know is that she was real strict about the order of things. Don't know that all the misses of the house weren't, though. But in her will, she left money for me and a few other folks that worked here in the house up until the end. So I think she did appreciate our work, or at least appreciated that we stayed on with her. She maybe wanted to make sure we had something to live on, till we found more work. And not every Mr. and Mrs. treated their workers well. We were always watching out for those folks in town, talked amongst ourselves to let folks know what was a good situation and what wasn't. And well, I know our pay was a little more than most folks, the men especially. Me being a maid, I was paid $30 a month. There really wasn't a whole lot of money to be made in women's work. Mr. William Dilworth, the head butler at Maymont, he was one of the best paid butlers in town. Think he made something around $100 a month. Our own wages by ourselves weren't ever really enough for one person to raise up a whole household, though. That's why you see just about everybody in a house about 12 years and up, sometimes younger, out there working. It's just the way it was. Every chance we'd get, we'd save up our money, though. It helped that we could take food home after all the meals that was made at the house. And sometimes we'd get little gifts, some jewelry, or pieces of furniture to put in our own houses. This life of serving others in their houses, I don't think it's what any of us would do if we didn't have to. But we kept our heads down like they wanted, did our work, and found our pleasure where we could. We made sure of that. Took a whole lot of resilience, wisdom, and skill to work in these houses back in those days. Maybe more than I think anyone will ever know.
Sally Mae Dooley changed up to 4 times a day and required assistance in doing so because of the intricate structures of the dresses she was wearing at the time. Fanny Waddy and Georgia Anderson served as ladies' maids at Maymont and worked closely with Sally to dress, bathe, and ensure her appearance was up to par with the standards of the time. Maymont Mansion is outfitted with 3 service bells, including one placed in Mrs. Dooley's bedroom. If Mrs. Dooley wanted to get ready or change, she would push the button on the wall and a bell would ring in the basement. A lady's maid, such as Fanny Waddy, would hear the bell and see the call box point to the correlated number for the room. She would then go to Mrs. Dooley and attend to her needs. These women were highly capable of styling hair and makeup. Additionally, it was helpful for a lady's maid to be a skilled seamstress. Thank you for joining us as we learn more about the lives of the resilient domestic staff here at Maymont. Please visit our website, www.maymont.org, to learn more about the history of African Americans at Maymont and beyond during the Gilded Age and Jim Crow era in Richmond. Also, be sure to check back for upcoming programs and special events. We hope to see you online or on the estate.